Good morning. I'm Priya-Mary Thomas, head of the Green Finance Institute, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Wake Up to GHS at COP26 show here at the Sir Roger Gifford studio at Glasgow, chaired by Axel Threlfall, editor-at-large at Reuters. The agenda for GHS at COP26 today will focus on the critical issues of how we get to a meaningful carbon price globally and the important role of a robust, credible, high-integrity carbon offset and how that market can play a role in channeling international climate finance to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, in particular through protecting the natural environment. Climate and nature, they are two sides of the same coin, and we can't solve for one without solving for the other. This is becoming increasingly widely recognised and was highlighted by the recent work of the Dasgupta Review. Our agenda today will look at this interplay between climate and nature, how we can ascribe a value to nature's eco-services to redirect capital towards nature-based solutions, and how we can embed natural capital considerations in mainstream financial decision-making. So with that, I will hand over to Axel to introduce our guests this morning. Axel, once again, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rianne-Marie. Welcome, everyone. I'm Axel Threlfall, editor-at-large at Reuters. This is the GHS morning show. A couple of really quick headlines I wanted to mention. Some sticking points on the Article 6 piece, of course. No great surprises there, I think, on the carbon pricing bit. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The other thing we're going to talk about this morning, nature, embedding nature and biodiversity into mainstream decision-making. Fantastic panel lined up as always. Let me just run very quickly through who we've got. Mark Carney, UN Special Envoy on Climate. Bill Winters, CEO Standard Chartered. David Craig, co-chair at TNFD. Emma Howard-Boyd, co-chair of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. Richard Saines, partner Pollination Group, and Sandrine Dixson-Declève, currently co-president of the Club of Rome. I'm speaking quickly because we lost about 10 minutes with that power outage just now. Mark and Bill, I'm gonna kick it off with you two for a little bit, and if anyone wants to jump in on this, because we're going to talk about carbon and some of the GFANS stuff. If anyone wants to jump in, and then we'll get to the nature bit. You had you were here on our first show Tuesday morning. You had the 130 trillion up your sleeve. You didn't tell us about it that morning. You left it to the next day, finance day.
Hold something back.
It created a great deal of impetus, of course. But of course, a massive pool of private capital is one thing. Getting it to do what you want it to do, what we need it to do, is very much another. Can you say with any conviction that we're really going to get that started now?
I think we are going to get, pardon me, Axel, and we are going to get it started. It's interesting, finance days historically at COPs is all about public financing. And you heard at the start, or you mentioned at the start, Selwyn Hart's comments about maybe some of the multilateral developments bank not stepping up in the way that was one thing that was really absent from Finance Day. So you had the 100 billion from the developed economies, and you had GFANS, the 130 trillion. Here's a few reasons why a lot of that money is going to move. We need all of that money to move. The first is that the commitments aren't just for some distant date. It's 50% fair share by 2030. You're one of the signatories of this, so you know it, as is Hugh. And it's 5-year decarbonization plans that really have to come out within the next 12, 18 months, depending on whether you're an asset manager or a bank. Annual reporting, et cetera. So the money needs to move, and so the institutions, many of which are already doing this, are looking for net zero aligned plans. One of the key things, and why I slightly hedged my answer at the start, is we need new structures to get that money to emerging and developing economies, particularly. And again, at the outset, you referenced scaling up of 10 or 13 times, depending on the minister or the authority that referenced it. Absolutely right. We need to scale up to about $1 trillion a year additional, emerging and developing world, and that's going to take not just the private money, but some new structures.
We'll come on to the private bit in a sec. Just very quickly on the MDBs, because of course you've said a lot on that. Are you as shocked and disappointed as the Selwyn?
I think we're all impatient and trying to innovate and determine new ways to get real leverage from public capital. After all, in the end, these are taxpayer dollars that are trying to make a difference for the climate. You have a wall of private money that's willing to go in. There's certain risks and market structures that need to be developed, and we need to get on with it.
Yeah. Are you all, Bill, GFANs really, really gung-ho now and ready? Or are you, and again, this is something we talked about on Tuesday, the slightly lackluster context from the G20, from the policy side. Are you still worried about stuff?
I think part of the reason that the GFANS is so important is that it provides this coalition that allows the financial sector to do what we had always been on the pathway to doing, but in an accelerated way with some agreed standards, with some shared objectives, a little bit of that competitive dynamic that happens when you find a way that you're steadily increasing the bar. One person increases the bar, others need to look at whether they can come along, and eventually they do. So I think it's been a fantastic catalyst to a process that was probably well underway in any case, but would not have gotten as far as it has without Mark's convening power and the actual structure that we put around the financial services contribution.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to something we mentioned at the top, and the carbon market bid and Article 6. I said, look, I don't want to sound cynical here, but no great surprise that this is a sticking point, this Article 6 piece. And of course, that's the government bit, and the VCM stuff is the private bit. I guess sticking points on Article 6 make it all the more important that you get your bit right. Just actually, give us a first take on the Article 6 bit. How stalled is this?
Oh, I wouldn't say it's stalled. Look, it's a negotiation. An Article 6 negotiation, like other COP negotiations, a bit like a trade negotiation. Nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. They've been working hard. I'm not directly involved in these negotiations, but there are important issues. The negotiators are working very hard on this. We've got a week left to go at COP, and I wouldn't,
You wouldn't rule anything out?
The sun's still up.
Okay, all right. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. But the mechanism that this creates, that piece, is really important for your piece, though, isn't it? Without it, how much wind do you lose? I mean,
there's an overlap in the sense that some parties that would participate in the voluntary carbon market will want to understand what the implications could be for their intergovernmental accounting and money flow arrangements. But the voluntary carbon market is fundamentally about corporations who have set out ambitions for net zero, who are completely on their transition pathways. Who have some difficult or impossible to evade residuals, and who are compensating on the way to net zero, who could use the offset markets for part of that. And most of the participants in the voluntary carbon market will be unimpacted by the outcome of the Article 6 negotiations.
Okay.
That said, maybe there's a way, it would be wonderful if they would converge over time. It would be wonderful if the understanding of what a high quality carbon credit is was consistent across markets. That would be a good win. It's not a necessary condition. It would be very helpful. And it would be wonderful if there was clarity between how the NDCs are interacting with a voluntary market transaction.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think an important thing to recognize, and let's take a page out of how difficult it has been to get to the 100 billion countries that honoring the Copenhagen commitment. This is a market, the voluntary market is a market that can scale to 100 billion, potentially 150 on some estimates, per year. And that's not public money, it's corporate money in. So this is real additionality in terms of money. And ideally, what's going to happen, obviously, is we'll get Article 6. I shouldn't say obviously, I mean, ideally, an agreement will come there. There will be that integration between the two. But in scale, I would expect that provided the voluntary market gets up and running, it is going to be the largest source of incremental capital for nature-based solutions.
Bill, provided the voluntary market gets up and running, where are you now? Just give us a sense of the progress, because of course you have this integrity council now. You're trying to bring together all these divergent views and interests. Where are you? Scale of 1 to 10, how far up are you?
Well, I think in terms of the work of the Integrity Council, which is taking what had been, we had 450 members in this task force. It's now a stood-up body called the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Markets. The heavy lifting in terms of what those standards are has been done. There's agreement at a reasonably detailed level, not a perfectly detailed level. So this Integrity Council will now take the final step to precisely specking out what is a qualifying core carbon contract. If I could just add one thing to Mark's comment, let's say we can get the voluntary carbon market to 100 billion per year of transfers. That's just the start, because that voluntary carbon market also enables a multiple of that in terms of financing. So what banks, capital markets, et cetera, will lend money into projects that are validated as being creditworthy, both from a credit perspective, but also from a carbon market perspective. And so it's the money that flows. It's also the financing ability that it unleashes.
Is there anywhere, again, I don't want to sound the cynic, but is there anywhere right now where carbon pricing is working really well enough to be a realistic example for our carbon-intensive world?
I think so.
Well,
Europe.
I would say Europe, exactly. I mean, I'm staring us in the face. Yeah. I mean, the price of carbon's, we've seen the way that the price of carbon's moved. And, look, and there's been a lot of learnings in that market. And, China's trying to apply some of those learnings there as well. These markets are, and look, and that goes to, core point. Market design is incredibly important. Getting the integrity right is important, but integrity brings scale.
Yep.
And that's why so much thought is being put in, through the Integrity Council on the supply side. And the last point, if I may, very important point that Bill made a few moments ago, which is on the demand side. Obviously, the first and foremost responsibility of the company is to reduce absolute emissions, but they should need, we're of the same view, to compensate for the emissions they still have. Yeah. So it's not and that is a stricter test than SBTI and others have had. But let's face it, we keep saying we're in code red, planetary emergency. Well, if you're emitting today, you should be compensating.
Okay. I know you guys want to come in on this. Yes. Go on, Emma, you start, and then Rick will come to you, and Sandrine.
So agree that it's been fantastic how dominant and up there the finance has been for COP26. We're heading into Nature Day. We're heading into Adaptation and Resilience Day on Monday. We've heard from Axel some of the criticism that is out there. What's your advice to those of us who are staying at COP to help us make sure that we're bringing in the right voices to this discussion? I'm particularly focused on those with land rights, indigenous land rights. Yeah. It's going to be vital that if we're going to build these markets in a credible way, that we're all talking to the right people, and it feels like this is a very inclusive discussion.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to the governance side? Well, I'll start, which is totally agree. First thing, and by the way, one of the issues in speaking up, in my experience, you would have more and others will, with indigenous peoples, one of the things that they quite often are quite suspicious of is government-to-government flows.
Exactly.
Because the government-to-government flows doesn't go to, part of the issue is that it stops at the government. It does not go to indigenous people, and quite, it's very. Anyways, you get the point, and you know it, and you'll continue to hear it. So that's the first thing. Second is for the governance design of the voluntary carbon market, there are 3 seats for indigenous people and representatives, and that process of people have applied and are looking and bringing them in at the core. And I would add as well that the overall governance percentages is 40% representation from the emerging and developing world, and it's a mixture as well across market participants. Of course, there are some. It is a market, but NGOs, other aspects of civil society, and very importantly, indigenous peoples.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so the Integrity Council has adopted a few first principles. One first principle is corporations must first reduce and only offset for the difficult to pay to remaining. The second is a do no harm principle. And it's central in the formation of the core carbon principles, is the do no harm ethos. Now, obviously easier said than done, and there will no doubt be debates amongst the standard setters as the Integrity Council does its work to determine what is harmful, either absolutely or relatively or gross or net. But with specifically established with an eye to the indigenous people and to the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals, that might be sacrificed in the interest of greenhouse gas emissions if we don't maintain the proper focus. So a lot of heavy lifting to go, but it's right in the top line of what the Integrity Council is doing.
Yeah, Rick, coming in quickly, and then Sandrine, and then we have David Craig here as well, of course, virtually. I want to bring David in as well. Go ahead.
I just wanted to amplify something that Mark said that is really important for folks who are concerned about these markets. There's a lot of trepidation about scaling the offset markets. Is this going to just be paper transactions, et cetera? The key here is about focusing on the decarbonization pathways, ensuring that is the guardrail, okay? And the offsets and the markets supplement. It's not in lieu of.
Exactly.
It's in addition to.
right.
And so that capital flow that goes in addition to the underlying reductions is really driving innovation, finance, as you said, to areas of the world that don't typically attract it. And so the rights of indigenous peoples are fundamental to that, because nature is a big part of the supply for these markets. And we can do this right. We can get this right and really provide value to a whole part of the world that hasn't yet been part of that value chain. And it's a shame that the narrative around these markets is confusing.
Yep.
But there's a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anyone here disagreeing with what you've just said. Sandrine, coming in.
Yeah, I just wanted to unpack a few points. The first is that when we look at Tuesday's agreements around nature, and having been the chair of the World Leaders' Day, I could sense that excitement. We had 100+ governments, but we also had 19.2 billion that was really announced as new capital flows, both going to indigenous peoples. And translating that into action is exactly what the indigenous people asked for. What does that mean concretely? Because I agree with Mark. If it goes straight into the pockets of the governments, will it then truly trickle down into meaningful funds for the work that they do? But I do want to unpack another issue. And being on the European market and having worked within the taxonomy, and I fully agree, do no significant harm is the principle that can start to put a measure on what this truly means on the ground. But on the other hand, we saw with the recovery plans across Europe, 0.5% has gone into biodiversity projects. Part of it is because member states don't even know what it means. So how do we translate concretely on the ground what capital flows mean in terms of biodiversity, in terms of nature-based solutions?
Let me, David, Craig, TNFD, I want to bring you in here and just sort of step back a little bit and ask you to what extent you feel we have or haven't grasped this interconnectedness between nature and climate, and then what TNFD is doing and how different that is to TCFD. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, morning, Axel, and pleasure to join you this morning. I mean, I think there's a growing awareness that climate and nature are really the same side of this financial and economic and natural coin. We're in a natural vicious cycle where the impacts of climate change are having a material and increasing impact on the natural ecosystems. And the degradation of those natural ecosystems then is accelerating the impact from climate change. I think it's well understood natural systems, and not just the forests, but the marine, the terrestrial, they've absorbed 60% of the man-made carbon to date. And as we degrade those systems, then our fight against climate change, the weapons that we have, are really reduced. These tools are reduced. We all know that the natural systems for absorbing carbon are far, far more efficient than the mechanical systems that are out there. And then on the plus side, protecting those, restoring them is really the most efficient way in implementing the offsets that the panel's just been talking about, and absorbing them. So they really are linked together. We've got to work on them together. TNFD is a few years behind TCFD. I think the knowledge and the understanding, particularly of the interface between finance and nature, as was just said, is a lot less at the moment. This is why we're moving quickly. We formed a task group in June. We're building on the success of TCFD. We've borrowed the same governance frameworks. In fact, 90% of our members are actually members of TCFD as well. We've bare no bones about reusing what TCFD has done and really trying to then understand how do we identify, manage, disclose upon those nature-related risks, and then how do we redirect capital so it's in that nature-positive direction, not the nature-negative.
Sorry to interrupt, David. Do you foresee, I mean, we talk about these two bodies, do you foresee tensions between reporting on nature and reporting on climate?
No, I don't think so. I think they're the same thing. And in fact, they've got to be done holistically. TCFD, TNFD are working very closely together. We're not standards bodies. We're informing the standards bodies. Our ultimate goal is that the standards end up in IFRS and the newly ISSB and the other standards groups that are out there. I think they have to work together. I think they're complementary. I don't think they're in conflict in any way. But I think what we have to be very careful of is we just focus on climate on its own and don't look at nature and biodiversity. We'll actually be damaging the very tools that will help us get to the net zero that we're trying to do.
Sorry. Did someone want to come in? Okay, yeah, go ahead, Sandrine.
Well, I was going to say it's a choice, and
yes.
when countries are actually looking at the choice, what do? They go straight to infrastructure investments, in particular regarding mitigation. It's much bigger, it's much sexier. They don't really know what it means materially on the ground to invest in biodiversity. Yes, on deforestation, we have a better idea. But all of the other criteria, when we look at the taxonomy, when we were trying to unpack how we actually put forward the right criteria for biodiversity and nature-based solutions, much more difficult.
Yeah. And how close, just Emma, before I bring you back in, David, how close are we to having investor usable company-specific data on performance in this space? I mean, you've been in this data game for a long time.
We're not starting from a blank sheet of paper. I mean, there's lots of expertise and knowledge. If you talk to the agriculture companies and others about what they do today, there's many years of learning. And in fact, there's many good data sets on things like forestry, water use, and others. It's not complete yet, though. It's very spotty. It's very patchy. There's a lot of work to do to get this to be comprehensive. Some parts of the world are much further ahead than others in reporting on this. Japan, interestingly, is one of the leading countries in the world on disclosing on nature-related risks. So it's patchy at the moment. We've got to create something that's well understood, takes a very complex topic and makes it simple for the market to adopt and do that. But it's work in progress. There's some way to go.
Yeah. Sorry, Hugh, you're hiding behind Emma, so I haven't actually seen you. Come on in. Yeah.
I think a key point, and working with David, is it's about decision useful data. And I think what's been very interesting for me about the conversations post GFAN's announcement is how do we make this real? So as we're engaging with companies, what do they need to track? How do we then bring that into a lending or an investing decision? And I think it's about standards, where there's been extraordinary work done this week, but then it's also getting quite granular about the business plans.
Yes.
And it's the same for nature too. Water usage is already quite well focused upon in many areas. In fact, actually, it's quite a good signal of a well-run company, but it's actually making it broader and deeper.
When you, Rick, and sorry, Emma, I will come to you, but Rick, when you speak to these investors here and elsewhere, I mean, what are they telling you? What is the reality when it comes to really convincing them to put their money into this? Are they getting enough? Is there enough transparency? Is there enough data? To David's point.
No.
What's the message?
Yeah, that's the work that needs to be done. But I think everybody has a general sense that nature provides worth to the economy, but it's a question of how do you integrate the value into the economic systems. In order to do that, you have to measure it. You have to have, as you say, comparable data. But if you just think about nature, how many supply chains are impacted by a thriving ecosystem? And we tend to ignore the utility to our economy of thriving ecosystems. But if we don't have thriving ecosystems, the whole engine of the economy is going to shut down. The economy and the environment are not separate systems. They're integrated systems.
Sure.
Right? Sure. So it's just a matter of figuring out how you integrate that value that's real into the economic engine.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Just a couple of quick observations. First is that the TNFD's job is much harder than the TCFD's job. We should just acknowledge that, because in the end.
But it's right that they're two separate bits. Like
financial and climate and nature information, ultimately they need to be integrated and managed accordingly. So I just want to acknowledge that this is tougher, and there is not an easy way out, which then maps, in my opinion, from biodiversity or nature into a dollar or a pound figure that then comes in. That way lies a form of optimization and further, ultimately further destruction, in my view. So you need to, take nature on its terms, and that's one set of points. And then the other point I make is that from an integration perspective, as we all know, maybe not everybody knows, but the ISSB, the first thing they're going to do is climate based on the TCFD. That is a game changer, because that brings the possibility of globally consistent standards on that. But then they're going to do something else. And the question is, the TNFD could be in a position where they're providing the something else and advancing the thinking about how integrated, how it is two sides of the same coin would be, that would be the ideal in terms of sequencing. There's a lot of work to be done in order to make sure that happens.
And David, hopefully you heard what Mark just said. I mean, that's I imagine where you're headed. Give us a sense of how progress looks and how excited you are and the sorts of conversations you're having, and if those are good conversations.
Well, I think Mark's right. It is harder. It is more complicated. I also agree you can't just put a price on nature. I think it creates false economics. We're making good progress. We actually intend to launch a beta framework early next year and put something into the market that can be usable. So it's not like we're going to wait 3 or 4 years before we've done this. We have to move quickly. We have to bring these climate-nature axes together and do that in the way that the market can adopt it and take something that is very complicated, but try and simplify it down. We just don't have there isn't the equivalent of the 1.5 degree or the parts per million for nature. There are other metrics you can use. We talked about water, we talked about forests, we talked about biodiversity, but there's no simple way of defining this down. So we've got to recognize that and create a framework that's slightly more complex. But we aim to release that early in next year so we can start working and testing it.
As you come, Rick, as you come up with strategies in this area, where's the place to focus first? The sector doing the most damage. What's the most important place to improve first, would you say, in this space?
Well, I think, the food system, our agricultural system, reinventing the agricultural supply chain, really focusing on from the farm to the community to the landscape and then through the supply chain all the way to the end users, the intermediaries, the brokers, the commodity markets. We need to have real good data throughout that, traceability, and understand the implications of those decisions in the economic system. And when we do that, the consumer-facing companies, the end users, when we can report out on all of that and really differentiate down through the supply chain, I think that's when we can start to get some changes.
Sandrine?
And this is where you do need to bring in a more local level as well. So it's great that we're talking about how this works at a global, from a global perspective. But from my experience chairing the environmental regulator, it is in England, it's really key that the environmental and nature regulators are working in lockstep with the economic regulators and in lockstep with the financial regulators. And I think that is one aspect that has been missed out.
And is it getting better?
I think those conversations are getting closer. But again, it depends on the different sectors. So yes, agriculture, yes, infrastructure, but we've got to make sure that as well as greening the system, we're coming up with the very, very practical projects that build the pipeline of what we need to invest in as well. And that's where the Green Finance Institute is focusing on working with DEFRA, working with the Environment Agency, working with philanthropists, working with civil society groups to build up the mechanisms, the projects that get real stuff to happen on the ground.
Okay, Hugh?
Yeah.
Sandrine.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on several of the points. The first is the dysfunctionality within the economic market that we've never placed a value on natural capital. And that is one of the key problems that we have. And we're slowly trying to place a value on natural capital, but we still haven't gotten it 100% right. Because we still are in a productive market, and we don't yet put that value. That's the first. The second is, if you look at the food system, and having sat actually on the resilience track as one of the key chairs for the UN Food System Summit, Emma's completely right. Local production for local consumption. We spent half the time talking about trade and commodities, the over-commodification of half of our products that actually are destructive to nature and don't place a value on nature is the biggest problem. So we need to get back to not only understanding local community needs, but that placing a value on nature then places a value on people. And right now we have a market that does neither. And that is why we need to shift the financial markets to service people, planet, and prosperity, and start to put in place the right criteria to measure what that means in practice.
Well, no, look, I agree. I want to build on what Emma said about the coordination problem. I mean, actually, one of the things I'm most excited about this week, whether it be GFANZ or the Focus on Nature, is trying to bring together problem solving around different initiatives. So actually, yesterday, I was chairing an event around the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and actually it was really about policy coordination. So if the finance is now ready, willing, and able, actually, are the projects there? If it takes 6 years to get a renewable plant, how can we accelerate that? So I think there's a lot of coordination problems which can be worked on post this event.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, Emma, this Adapt or Die piece report that you guys have put out, we've talked about this at length, but the issue of adaptation being underrepresented in favour of mitigation. What are governments actually doing? Well, first, what more do you think governments can do? But what are governments actually doing to create this enabling ecosystem, if you like, for financing adaptation and the adaptation measures?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's just governments. I think it is everybody. Investors, businesses need to understand the scale of the physical risks that we are now facing from climate shocks. And therefore, as we are investing in our net zero, in our transition, we need to make sure that those investments are ready for the rainfall, the heat. And that's something that needs to be sped up so that the race to resilience is racing alongside the race to net zero. And I don't think that that is understood. So it is governments, it's cities, everywhere needs to factor in that as you're transitioning, you need to be aware of what you're facing. And this is where nature plays a massive role as well. And we keep on separating our discussions into different boxes.
I was just going to say what you just said, Emma, that one of the issues here is nature can be infrastructure. When we think about coastal flood mitigation, we think about urban flood mitigation. There's a lot of interesting design work going on in green infrastructure, more permeable spaces, more use of nature to manage and regulate water flows and the like. And the cost differential between gray infrastructure, redesigning all the water management systems versus leveraging nature in what it does well, there's a really interesting opportunity there for us to be smarter about it.
I just wanted to bring in the tipping points issue because we don't talk about it enough, and Emma's actually right, and you're right as well. I mean, the fact is that resilience is building resilience through the system because we know that the cost of inaction is going to be so much more. And so planning for that. We also know that biodiversity loss is creating the pandemic that we just had. And therefore, those triple tipping points of biodiversity loss, increased pandemics, and climate crisis together means that we must invest now. Otherwise, the costs are much higher.
How, Mark and Bill, but Mark, how are the GFANs and I guess the bigger context conversations you've been having this week, how much of this is in those conversations? And in terms of a seat at the table, if you like, a proper seat at the table.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One is there's another tipping point that's going on this week, and finance is at the tipping point. Finance tipped over the tipping point in terms of getting to the scale commensurate with the problem. In fact, exceeding the scale commensurate with the problem of mitigation. Very clearly of mitigation. We're talking about adaptation, resilience, and rebuilding, ultimately rebuilding nature. But that sort of first point being met, money's got to be put to work, things have to happen, but it's absolutely, it is very, very significant what came out with GFANs. The second is that in the insurance side, it has moved quite substantially. The Global Resilience Index is coming. I think I just pre-announced something, but anyway, there you go. Some
global resilience,
which is a series of metrics. It's going to be on Resilience Day, I presume. But it's but this is the best insurers, reinsurers around the world. They can unveil this, but the metrics, the key metrics around resilience, bringing their expertise globally, so you can identify where the biggest challenges are today, will be tomorrow, some prospect of reinsuring some of that, insuring some of that, but really getting capital, government capital, concessionary and otherwise, to these problems. So identifying where the code red is most urgent, if I can advance it. But to your core question, so those are all positives. Your core question, this is becoming part of the solution because as the financial system sort of relentlessly focuses on getting to 1.5 degrees, it's like, okay, what are the other issues associated with that? And this is the top issue. So it's coming into the conversation. It didn't start, it wasn't where the conversation started.
Yeah. But, that's a process that takes a while, right?
Well, it's a process that's happening because it's being developed today. Best practice transition plans are being developed today, both for financial institutions and for companies. The voluntary carbon market is being developed today, and the implication. So it can be integrated to those conversations now. I mean, it doesn't have to be sequential.
Yeah, I of course agree with that. And I say that the principles that have been set out, whether it's in the context of the voluntary carbon markets or the transition plans that we're talking about, I think are reasonably well understood. The kinds of discussions that we're having here, which I've been having all week, and it's certainly in every discussion where we've been just having reviews or discussions around voluntary carbon markets or net zero transition plans for banks, the nature considerations have come in. So that's obviously one of the benefits of a COP type process. But obviously it can't all happen at COP. It's got to happen as we get back out. And then there is a power for a market in here, and not over assessing our ability to put a value on nature. Starting there, what we are trying to build into the voluntary carbon market construct is that you'll have a set of core carbon principles, which are really about carbon and do no harm. But the idea is to have a liquid, transparent, visible market around which people can execute other transactions, where other co-benefits can be brought in very straightforwardly and transparently. And whether that co-benefit is relating to water rights or the improvement of the lives of indigenous people, and there are corporations on the pathway to net zero that will actually pay extra for other good things, and they should be recognized for that, and also assessed in terms of the effectiveness of these investments that they're making.
Sure. Look, I'm where we are on the time. We lost a little bit, of course. So there's a couple of other bits and pieces I want to ask you, and then we'll give you a final crack as well to the panel. But I want to come back to the price, this idea of a price, and ask you how the scaling up of VCMs, the role that will play, the important role that will play in informing people's understanding of what the price should actually be. I mean, that's an important part of the process.
It'll be absolutely centrally important. And I think the value of having a transparent and credible price that's linked to high integrity contracts could be even more impactful than the value of the money that transfers from the pockets of the net zero committers into the net zero recipients, because it will inform corporate and government decision making at every level, and enforce the reduction action that otherwise is coming not at the pace that we need. So,
and I'm sure you both get fed up of being sick of being asked where that price should be. What sort of price we're looking at here? I mean, there's so many numbers out there, but let's $70, $75, but actually, what we really need, would you say, surely, is 100, 150 plus, no?
I'm not sure what we need. The voluntary carbon market today trades in many different levels for different standards, but for reasonably high integrity contracts today, it's trading at $8 or $9 or $10 per ton. That price I know is wrong. Right? That's the wrong price. Is the right price 75 or 100?
Yeah,
what do you think?
I think we're mixing things. The 75 to 100 by the end of the decade is the price, general estimated price that flips over a series of technologies that keeps us on the path to getting emissions down. So that's a compliance market type price, okay? And we have reasonable prospect we're going to have those prices or higher. What we're talking about is a market which is compensating for the emissions that are still happening and driving it. So the prices don't necessarily get fully integrated because remember, it's not a get out of jail card, so you can't trade one off against the other. But as I entirely agree with Bill, given the current prices are not the right price. But it's because we don't have a proper market, and that's what's being built, and that's what can be driven.
Just a very quick editorial comment. It's not just we don't have a proper market, we don't have proper standards. So there's too many credits floating around out there that are not high quality. If we stick to the core carbon principles that the Integrity Council is now finalizing, we will have a higher price.
Right. I'm going to come to sort of concluding remarks.
Quickly, I was just going to say the price will go up and down depending on the marginal abatement cost curves for getting to the reductions that we're trying to get to, and Mark made the point. So
yeah.
Building on Mark's point, I fully agree. Again, you cannot match the investment on adaptation with the investment on mitigation. You just can't. The values are very different. But I think one thing we haven't talked about is how do you ensure that then you put those values into proper accounting mechanisms and balance sheets? Because we haven't gone to the other side, which is across the board, we now need to have nature and adaptation included in balance sheets. And that's also going to be fundamental.
David, I know you're heading up to Glasgow shortly. Who do you have to talk to over the next week, do you think? Who's top of your list here?
Well, I think we've got to get the financial institutions understanding the risk. First and foremost, that they're praised, as someone was said earlier, that the amount of risk through the supply chain is huge. When you start unpicking it and realizing the amount of our global economy that is really dependent on natural systems, it's staggering. So I think building that awareness first and understanding that is the first place to start on really understanding it. We then got to work with the corporations. I think the companies, the agricultural firms, the fishing firms, they understand a lot of this science. They understand a lot of the issues, and trying to tease out of them, where do we get the metrics, where do we get the standards that was said that make them work, I think is where we've really got to work hard, which is how we form the group. Then we can talk to standards bodies, regulatory bodies, and others. I think we've got to really figure out this intersect between the corporates and the finance first, and get that understanding well set before we go out to the market with something which is really usable and market-led to do this.
Okay, thank you, David. Hugh, go ahead.
Well, look, just building on what David said, I think it's important to get the data and the standards right. But really, this is what we're talking about here is about incentives. And the more we get a price on carbon, both mitigating and ahead, it starts to influence corporate and financial behaviour. Yeah.
We need to make this real for the real world as well, this conversation, so it's understood, and that will come through the delivery of projects on the ground that the general public understand. And that's where we need to turn our attention to, and that's certainly where the Green Finance Institute is focusing.
You know, wearing our journalist hats, of course we get excited when the IEA comes out and says 1.8, given the current pledges, given the methane announcement, is achievable. What do you feel when you hear things like that? Is your enthusiasm tempered because you're part of these discussions and they are right now just pledges, and it takes a lot to make a pledge actually a real commitment?
I think it's Paris was a great success, but the road from Paris was we moved very slowly on it and we lost a lot of time. So it's about the road from Glasgow now in implementation, and then we have these tremendous enablers, but also feedback loops that come from finance, because finance has made these pledges 50% down by 2030, and they're looking for those projects. They're looking for those transactions going to get down. And if there is a gap between country ambition, country policies, markets being enabled, other things, it's going to be called out in real time, because finance is actually going to be reporting on an annual basis.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Finance will be reacting in real time, as will the supply chain. And this is, I think, one of the most compelling issues that go beyond the national level commitments is that the pressure on exporters or domestic companies to the pressure from finance and the pressure from the people who buy their product. Everything is converging onto this net zero requirement, and to the extent that there are mandatory transition plans, et cetera, in markets that are buying that product or providing the finance, the momentum is building. Yeah. There are very few places to hide at this point, which can only be a good thing.
That's a nice line to end on. Very few places to hide. All right, look, it's been another super conversation. Thank you all very, very much. You made my job very easy, actually, I've got to say. You bounced off each other very, very well. Look, that's it for the GHS shows for this week. We are back. I am back on Thursday next week for Cities Day, and that's going to be a fascinating discussion as well. But look, thank you very much indeed for joining us all week. I'm Axel Threlfall for Reuters. Have a great weekend, and then we start again on Monday. Thanks very much indeed.